We want to welcome, on behalf of Kingston's Buried Treasures, I want to welcome everybody here tonight for the second installment of our lecture series, which is, we are having this monthly lecture series. Each month we're choosing a different person of local historic interest and having one of our local experts give a presentation on it. Tonight's presentation is on General George Sharpe, and our presenter is Walt Witkowski. So if everybody can give him a hand, and we'll begin.
I thank you, my fellow guinea pigs. Why do I say it that way? I've never done this particular presentation before. You've never heard it before. I've never worked one of these PowerPoint things before. So we're going to have a good old time here. But we'll be fine. You're going to have to forgive me. There's a lot of information on Mr. Sharpe. And I had no time to really memorize this, so I will be looking at notes. You'll have to forgive me for that. Also, I had forgotten how nasty it is to get to uptown Kingston on a Friday night at this hour and to find a place to park. I'm over in front of the courthouse, so I apologize for being a little late. Okay, here's our buried treasure for this month, George Henry Sharpe. George was born in Kingston, February 26, 1828, and see, this is what I'm... There we go, hit it a few times. Okay, so this is what I mean. Okay, so we'll do the best we can with this. George was born to Henry and Helen Sharpe, February 26, 1828. George's father was a successful merchant. His mother, Helen, was part of the Hasbrook family. George's father passed away at age 42. George wasn't quite 2 years old yet. He left some money to the family, so his mother, Helen, and George, well, they went overseas for about 3 years. I think that being exposed to Europe is something that was very helpful to George, something I don't think he ever forgot. Now he comes back, the family returns in 1833. Young George is remembered as a wiry blonde youth with a love for books and learning. He was educated at the Kingston Academy and also at the Albany Academy. As was the custom of the day, a guardian was assigned. With the male of the family being dead, there was a guardian assigned. The first guardian was one of George's uncles. He passed away. There was then a family friend, Judge Severin Bruin. Now, the judge was a mentor and the role model. Okay, for George for the rest of his life. Judge Bruin is described as a true patriot, a fine classical scholar, possessed of a keen sense of humor, and in all estimations a Christian gentleman beyond all else. His influence on George will become obvious, as you'll see. And indeed, George names his first son after the judge. George has this gift for scholarship. He loves books. He has a skill for language, for English, French, Latin. Serves him well. In 1848, at age 15, he starts attending Rutgers University. He graduates in 1847. He actually does the salutatory address in, quote, polished and graceful, unquote, Latin. I don't know if any of you remember your Latin studies. You know, we had a lot of that in Kingston High School. Not me, somebody did. Anyway, after that, he attended Yale University Law School. He graduated from there in 1849 at age 21. George, it was said, was considered the best educated man at that time in Ulster County. He began, though, his study of law, where there's actually that apprenticeship, before he graduated from law school with an attorney, George Strong, in New York City. And this was even before he reached the age of maturity at age 21. But the attorney, Mr. Strong, thought well enough of George that he actually had him argue a few cases. When George does finish school, he's got considerable wealth built up by the judge. He also invests some of this. He invests in, for instance, he's a forward-looking man, so he invests in the Hudson River Railroad and other successful enterprises. And indeed, over time, his mother turns her business affairs over to George as well. Around this time also, George is beginning a courtship with his third cousin, Caroline Hasbrook, but not unusual for the day. They become engaged in 1854 and married in 1855. He'll always refer to the love of his life as Carrie. In early manhood, George is described as not handsome, but possessed of a high quality of personal magnetism and charm. He's on the short side of medium build. The blonde hair is now brown. He's considered good-natured and known to be an excellent horseman. He had a strong sense of noblesse oblige. I believe that stays with him his whole life and explains some of the paternalism that he maintains for his men in his 120th New York. He's also interested in the Hasbrook family tree and their coat of arms. Before he enters the bar, he travels to Cuba and then to Europe for another 3 years. Again, this, I think his mother taking him over there at an early age made a big impression on him. He actually studies French in Paris, and he serves from 1850 to 1851 as an attaché to the U.S. Embassy in Vienna, as well as the embassy in Rome. He returns to Kingston, an accomplished linguist, an experienced diplomat, a connoisseur of art, literature, and fine food. In 1854, he passes the bar. He starts his practice with the partnership of Hasbrook, Sharpe, and Linderman. He also has business dealings with John Steele, who becomes our congressman from the district in 1860 and 1862. He builds his business. He is an upwardly mobile person. There's another avenue for a person at this time to move ahead in society. And that avenue is to serve in the New York State Militia. He begins this new service. He then becomes acquainted at that time with George Pratt, who becomes the colonel of the 20th New York State Militia. He has dealings with George as the Ulster County Historical Society is formed. And we have notes here that in August of 1858, Sharpe is elected, which is the way things were done at that time, as captain of Company B of the 20th Militia. Now, the war drums are beating, the Civil War is getting closer. He resigns his captaincy, April 5th of 1861. Now, this is just a week before Fort Sumter is fired upon. Don't know why he did this. Could be he just figured he had too much to do with his business, et cetera, et cetera. He's out of town when Fort Sumter is fired upon. Now, the effect of Fort Sumter is like Pearl Harbor being attacked. It's like the Twin Towers going down. This is a major, major event, a shock to the North. He returns home to Kingston immediately. He begins recruiting to flesh out his Company B so that there's enough people in it so it can go with the regiment as they leave to go to the war front. He does this, by the way, without asking his colonel if he should start doing this, but not exactly the thing to do, but he does it. He starts working with John Rudolph Tappan, and they set up their recruitment in the Old Dutch Church, not the Old Dutch Church, St. Joseph's Church around the corner. Tappan describes the recruitment. By the way, Tappan is a captain, say that 3 times fast, with the 20th Militia. He later becomes a major with the 120th New York, and then it's lieutenant colonel. Tappan describes the recruitment. Quote, "From the time we hung a flag out of the old brick church," which is St. Joseph's, it was an armory at the time, "between the morning of one day and the evening of another, we enlisted 248 men," unquote, more than enough for 2 companies. As the men were sworn in, they were sent over to the Academy Green. Tappan and Sharpe were assigned to be the principal drill instructors for all the men in the regiment. April 28, 1861, they leave for the war front, that is the 20th Militia. They take boat and go on down the river. Sharpe describes this boat trip. He says, "Our whole trip to New York City was an ovation. Thus, the Hudson Valley shows to the first non-New York City regiment to leave for the front its appreciation, its patriotism." In other words, we've got something else to be proud of here in Ulster County. 20th Militia is the first non-New York City regiment to leave for the war front. Well, they're posted in Annapolis and then Baltimore, which is really the front lines at this time of the war. They're in service for 90 days. The rail lines had to be kept open from New York to Philadelphia through Baltimore to Washington, D.C. Remember, Maryland almost secedes from the Union. Had that happened, Washington, D.C. would have been totally isolated from the North. So it's an important duty, it's an important post. It's mostly guard duty, but they keep the rail lines open. Sharpe, by all estimations, does a good job as captain. There is one incident that happens. It's an abnormal lack of good judgment on George Sharpe's part. June 26, 1861, hard day for the regiment. They've been out marching all day, working hard. Get back to camp, they now need to be fed. Colonel Pratt says, "Go ahead, let's feed the men." Well, they go to the commissary officer, who is William Lounsbury, a future mayor of Kingston. There's a certain order that the companies are supposed to be fed in. Sharpe jumps the order. He wants his men fed first. This causes a ruckus. Colonel Pratt hears about it, goes over there, says, "Wait a minute, stand down, Sharpe. Your men get fed second, third, whatever it was." Sharpe refuses. He refuses a direct order from his commanding officer in time of war on the front lines. Not a good thing. Colonel Pratt doesn't back down. He calls out Company F, commanded by Captain Flynn. He has them assemble with their muskets loaded. They face Company B. Pratt says to Flynn, "Will you stand down? Will you go back?" Well, he says that to Sharpe. He then says to Flynn, "Will you fire on these men if ordered?" Flynn says, "Yes, I will, if you order it." Sharpe's good judgment returns. He returns to bivouac. The men are fed. All is right with the world again. By all accounts, he fulfills his duties well for the rest of the 90-day service on the part of the 20th Militia. They return to Kingston. I'm going to just drop that there. The end of July 1861, Sharpe returns to his civilian life. He grows the law practice. In the fall of 1861, he's selected to be a delegate to the Republican State Convention. He's chosen a member of the State Committee. He uses his diplomatic skills to get the war Democrats, which are, that party is called the People's Party at this time, to support the Republican slate for the election. March of 1862, he runs for supervisor at Kingston, but he loses that election. Summer of 1862, Lincoln calls for an additional 300,000 volunteers. Governor Edwin Morgan, governor of New York, is approached by Secretary of State William Seward, a former senator, former governor of New York. Seward says, "See if you can get Sharpe to raise a regiment." Morgan contacts Sharpe. Sharpe's in bed. He's suffering from a bronchial infection. He gets out of the sick bed, though, and within 22 days, he raises a regiment of over 1,000 men. This is just amazing. He's all over Ulster and Greene County, setting up meetings, speaking patriotically to people, dragging them in. there's one township, this is in the regimental history, I love the way these people, they wouldn't really quite say which township. There was one township in Ulster that didn't supply any recruits. Sharpe couldn't have this. By the way, I think I'm now supposed to kick this thing ahead. Well, mine is a mouse, and that's usually. Okay, I'm so sorry. Okay, learning curve. Okay, so here's Sharpe in his colonel's tunic. Notice he must not have known, or he must have known he was going to be colonel, but he didn't have his ranks yet on his shoulders. Okay, there's this one township. No recruits are forthcoming from this particular township. Sharpe can't have this. He wants everybody from the county represented in his regiment. He goes down to this unnamed township, sets up another meeting, speaks to them. He ends his comments by saying, rather than see no one from this township become part of my regiment, I'll resign my colonelcy. I'll send it back to Governor Morgan, and I'll enroll as a private from here so that you're represented. This has the effect he wants it to have. Enough people do indeed enlist that there's at least a platoon of men that come from this township. So he's successful in that. The men really have no training at all when they leave for the war front on August 22nd, 1862. Now, he leaves with 900 men, not quite the full 1,000 are fit, may have had a medical issue or this sort of thing. Just as they're leaving, it comes time to choose the number for this regiment. A list is provided by the governor. Sharpe looks at it. He chooses the 120th, so that, well, quote, in order that in name as well as in feeling we might be associated with the old 20th New York State Militia. So these bonds are strong here. They go to Fairfax County Courthouse. They train, they drill. Sharpe has to learn his command skills. He has to deal now. These are people. When we're 150 years away, sometimes we idealize things, but Sharpe has to deal in these opening weeks and months with deserters, drunkenness, thievery, hygiene issues, insubordination. I wonder, as he's dealing with insubordination, what does he remember about his time with Company B? I really think he learned his lesson there because he was a good colonel, while he was there. He also aided his soldiers. He tried to maintain morale as best he could. They are away from home, that sort of thing. As they're paid, he's made an arrangement with a banker here. He'll take the money to Washington, D.C. It's then wired to the Rondout Bank so that the families receive their soldiers' pay in a quicker way. September of '62, his bronchial problems come back, but he goes to Washington. He's treated by an assistant surgeon general. He regains his health, which mirrored, he said, his, quote, splendid physical condition during the 3-month service. October of '62, he's put in temporary command of 2 regiments and a battery in the Upton Hills part of the defenses around Washington, D.C. This is considered a key part of the defense. There was a rumor of an attack. By all accounts, he acquits himself well. There's no attack, but he does well. October of 26, the 120th joins the Army of the Potomac. They're part of the Excelsior Brigade of Major Dan Sickles, 2nd Division of the 3rd Corps. This starts a lifetime association with Mr. Sickles, General Sickles, I should say. They're in reserve at the Battle of Fredericksburg. We have Ambrose Burnside, the general in charge of the Army of the Potomac. They're lucky they're in reserve. They do cross the Rappahannock River. They come under some skirmishing fire. A few men are wounded. Sharpe describes the conduct of the 120th under its first hostile fire. as marked with coolness and propriety in the discharge of their duties. Again, it's a good thing they're in with reserve. There's 12,600 casualties in this battle that the Union Army alone suffers. Okay, they're also part of the infamous Mud March. This is Burnside trying to retrieve his reputation and steal a march on Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. January 20th, 1863. Well, the Army starts out January in Virginia. The heavens open. Rains for 2 days. The whole Army is mired in mud. They finally turn the whole kit and caboodle back. They go back to camp, and they're back there in their bivouacs. Sharpe states, "I think we're stationary now. Nothing but balloons can move us." So, the morale of the Army is in the dumps. Illness and disease has taken its toll on the regiment. Of the 900 that left Kingston, there's only 400 fit for duty when this mud march starts, and that only is going to get worse as the winter approaches. Sharpe is concerned about his men. He tries to get them into the Provost Guard. That's operated by General Marsin Patrick. He's the general of that the 20th New York State Militia is brigaded with. He has no luck in that. Now, after the Mud March, President Lincoln replaces Burnside with Joseph Fightin' Joe Hooker. Hooker decides that he needs to revamp the Army. He needs to get the morale up. He also knows that he needs to build up his Secret Service. So this is, I'm actually, I think, one behind where I wanted to be. But this is Sharpe in his field uniform, I believe. Oops, man. That one of him in a bus shot there. I guess I can't go backwards. So they're seated. I was trying to represent him as he's setting up what's called the Bureau of Military Intelligence. This is something that Hooker wants. He approaches Marsin Patrick. Patrick's the Provost Marshal General of the Army. He's also a very proper man. He's also a very fastidious man. He's described by one gentleman in the room here as a martinet. And that could very well be true. So, difficult man to work with, difficult man. He doesn't want to get his hands dirty. Marsin Patrick does, dealing with the type of people that a 19th century man might think would be a spy or involved in espionage. He says in his diary, quote, "I do not fancy the class of men, and I think they do not fancy me." Well, he's met Sharpe. He thinks, well, gee, maybe Sharpe with his lawyer's analytical abilities will be good for this job. He's a fellow New Yorker. Patrick knows about Sharpe through the officers in the 20th New York State Militia. He also remembers Sharpe tried to get the 120th into the Provost Guard. So Sharpe thinks about this. He decides that, yes, this is a duty he wants to do. Our modern CIA, in a historical report, says of Sharpe's BMI, Bureau of Military Information, quote, "the first all-source intelligence organization in U.S. history," unquote. Sharpe and his staff are producing intelligence-based reports based on a quiet, meticulous analysis. And now he never has more than 70 people on his paid payroll. In this same report, the BMI is described as it obtained, collated, analyzed, and provided reports based on many data sources. This is something new. This hasn't been done before. It was called the Secret Service before the Bureau of Military Information. You may have heard the name Alan Pinkerton. He was running the Secret Service under McClellan. He had some scouts. They'd go out. They'd gather information. They'd return with it. It may or may not be accurate. McClellan always thought that he was faced by at least twice as many Confederates as he actually was. So how accurate the information was, who knows. When he's bounced out, McClellan, Pinkerton leaves as well. Burnside really does next to nothing with the Secret Service. He's now bounced out after Fredericksburg. Hooker steps in. He wants this new service. Almost immediately, not Patrick, but Sharpe starts producing good results. The results are really decisively positive for the Army of the Potomac. I didn't know all that much about Sharpe's work with the Bureau of Military Information. I'm firmly convinced after this study that the Army of the Potomac wouldn't have been anywhere near as successful without the services of Sharpe and his men. He worked primarily with John McEntee, another Kingstonian, and John Babcock. Now they are in this picture. You'll see McEntee all the way to your right. They called him Captain John Babcock. Now he's to Sharpe's left. The fellow in between Babcock and McEntee is listed as unknown in a number of where you see this picture posted, but it's now believed he's either a Lieutenant Paul Oliver or a Lieutenant Frederick Manning. I've seen their names on reports in the official records of the War of the Rebellion. So whoever this fella is, he's one or the other of them, he's an integral part of this team. Now, the reports are described as understated but confident. They still exist. There's box after box after box of these in the National Archives, many of them in Sharpe's own hand. Over time, he's now pooling results from the scouting expeditions, spying behind enemy lines, interrogating prisoners and deserters. He takes the cavalry reconnaissance reports, he merges those into balloon observations, signal flag and telegraph intercepts, captured Confederate documents, newspapers from beyond enemy lines, letters, and information from other military units that may have observed something and turned it in. So a few months after he starts, Sharpe and his BMI produces a highly accurate order of battle, that is, who's in what corps, then divisions, then brigades, and then regiments in the Confederate Army, where they're located, whether they move or not, where the artillery's posted, how well are they supplied, what sort of topography are they occupying, how good's the enemy morale. All this information is now going to General Hooker. He uses this information to help plan and execute his Chancellorsville campaign. Now, it's an important campaign. Basically, Hooker tries to come up and around and in behind Robert E. Lee, who's still by Fredericksburg. He does this. It's a great maneuver. Now, Hooker then loses his nerve in the Battle of 2nd and 3rd May. Union Army is again defeated. It's Robert E. Lee's ideal battle. There's 18,000 Union casualties after that battle. Battle doesn't fail because of George Sharpe. Sharpe has done his job, led to a brilliant campaign. It was the execution that didn't work. So now there's a brief story. There's a story that there, of course, are prisoners of war held by the rebels. These men are wounded, some of them. Hooker would like to get them back. Usually a flag of truce is agreed upon between the two armies, and this can be effected. It didn't happen. Didn't happen. No flag of truce. Hooker still wanted these men back. He asks Sharpe, can he try to get the men back? Sharpe thinks about it, decides he can, goes across the river, is fired upon by Confederate pickets, not hit, meets with a Confederate officer who says, gee, I don't have the authority to do this. Says, well, okay, but are you hungry? Well, every soldier's hungry. He says, look, I've got some great food, got some wine, champagne on the other side of the river. Send one of your officers back with me. We'll get it, we'll bring it back, we'll have a meal. This happens, long story short, little food, little drink, little champagne, little extra champagne. Confederate officer sees his way clear to allow the release of these wounded prisoners of war. Sharpe states that he always considered this one of his finest achievements. So, back to the Bureau of Military Information. Babcock there, let me check myself. Am I supposed to be moving on to another slide here, folks? Let me just make sure. I don't think so quite yet. After Chancellorsville, after consulting with Richmond, Robert E. Lee decides he's going to invade the North again. So he starts planning and then executing his Gettysburg campaign. Now, Sharpe has been continuing to do his homework. He's been continuing to gather intelligence. Come on there, puppy. As we say at home. There we go. This is another shot of the VMI being in camp. You may not be able to read the caption in cursive under there. This says that this is Sharpe and staff. I don't know if that's General Sharpe. Doesn't really look like him to me, but who knows? He's got a beard. He looks to me more like McEntee, but I don't know. You think? Seward, yeah. To keep us moving ahead, I know we just have an hour here. Sharpe continues to see what's going on with the Army of Northern Virginia. Keeps gathering information. He starts seeing that they're pulling out. They're pulling out of the line. They're starting to go north. A recent scholarly work says that the BMI's work here, its intelligence work, was more important than the standard knowledge of, well, there were some cavalry expeditions across the lines. That's how Hooker found out that Lee was moving. Now says that really it was the BMI that realized Robert E. Lee's heading north. The information it gets to Hooker. Sharpe reports, all his sources report that the rebels, quote, are under marching orders, unquote, for a campaign of, quote, long marches and hard fighting, unquote, in an area where there's no railroad transportation. Well, where's that? That's enemy lines. Quote, all the deserters say the idea is very prevalent in the ranks that they are about to move forward upon or above our right flank, unquote. A couple days later, John McEntee, who's with a cavalry unit, confirms this. He talks to a captured contraband, which is a slave. Now, Southern officers wouldn't credit their slaves with much intelligence. They'd say all sorts of things in front of these folks. They would then be captured. Well, these are intelligent people. They'd report what they heard. They also reported what they've seen. This particular contraband named Charlie Wright has seen the Army of Northern Virginia moving north. McEntee questions him and then reports back to Sharpe, I think his statements are reliable. This intelligence, with the cavalry reports, gets Hooker to start moving the Army of the Potomac north in time to shield Washington, D.C., and get the Army to Gettysburg in time to hold the important high ground. This is our buried treasure from Kingston, helping to get us in the right spot at the right time. Now, there's another way that Sharpe directly impacts the outcome at the Battle of Gettysburg. July 1st, heavy fighting. July 2nd, heavy fighting. Sharpe's in the middle of this. He's still gathering intelligence. There's over 1,300 Confederate prisoners of war taken. He's finding out what regiments they're from. There's over 100 regiments engaged at this point from the Army of Northern Virginia. Now, Sharpe also has to know that on that second day, that July 2nd, his 120th has suffered horrific casualties. He also knows his brothers in the 20th Militia suffered horrific casualties on the first day. but he's doing his job. There's a council of war held with now General Meade. He's in command of the Army. He takes command as the Army of the Potomac's moving north. Hooker says, gee, no, I can't do this anymore. Lincoln appoints Meade. Meade doesn't know that the Bureau of Military Information has all this info. He has to study up on this, and he sees the value of it quickly. So, here at the end of July 2nd, in the small building that Meade has as a command post, there's a meeting of Meade and a couple of his corps commanders. Do they stay and fight another day, or do they leave? Sharpe is called in. The way the story goes, over here there's a plate of hardtack crackers and a half pint of whiskey. Nobody's touched it. Meade asks Sharpe, should we stay or go? What information have you gathered? He says, General, give me an hour or two, I'll be back. Sharpe's been busy. He's tired, he's hungry. He looks at those crackers and that whiskey, but out he goes. He's back a couple hours later. No one's touched the plate of crackers or the whiskey. He makes his report. Over 100 regiments engaged already from the Army of Northern Virginia. He can state there's only one division that has not been engaged, and that's Pickett's division. Winfield Scott Hancock, who's in the room, sits up and says, General, we've got them nicked. There's only one division that hasn't been engaged. Meade, the other officers converse, decide they're going to stay. They'll fight it out one more day. Hancock then looks at Meade and says, General, do you think Sharpe's earned a cracker and a drink of whiskey? Nobody actually took a cracker or a drink of whiskey. There wasn't enough to go around. Thus, you see the brotherhood of the men under arms and in this era. Okay. Sharpe, of course, stays with the Army. He's still collecting information. As the war progresses, U.S. Grant comes from the west. He's now in charge of the Army of the Potomac, as well as all the other armies under the Union flag. Now, Sharpe is not always right. He doesn't catch everything. He misses when General Jubal Early takes his men up to the Shenandoah Valley. He misses when Hampton, who's a cavalry officer with the Confederacy, runs his beefsteak raid, basically came behind the Army, stole all our cattle, and went back with it. He misses General Gordon's attack in March of 1865 on Fort Stedman. But it doesn't diminish the work that Sharpe's been doing with the BMI. Grant quickly recognizes this, makes use of the information that's gathered. Sharpe ends up promoted to Brevet Brigadier General in December of 1864, and then Brevet Major General by war's end. Grant says, as I say, now he's with the Army of the Potomac, he says of Sharpe's work that Lee, quote, could not send off any large body without my knowing it. And now this is something from historian Stephen Budiansky. I'm going to try to move away from the BMI and close out with Appomattox here. But Budiansky says, yet as a recent U.S. Army study of the BMI notes, a fair reading of history would unquestionably place Sharpe among the ranks of America's most important intelligence directors. He established the first truly modern intelligence organization, pioneering the practice of comparing intelligence from a number of sources and evaluating it before passing it on. He also clearly saw his job as being one of telling it like it is, rather than telling it like the commander wants to hear. So, Sharpe is with the Army. After that attack on Fort Stedman, U.S. Grant realizes, probably from the information gathered by Sharpe from these Confederate prisoners. Now, initially the Confederates punched through our Union line, but the Confederate Army is stretched so thin, Grant knows there has to be a weakness someplace. He orders a counterattack along the whole line. This is done. Lee's army is punctured. The long retreat to Appomattox happens. The BMI continues to gather information the whole way there. And as they're, now Sharpe says he was in the parlor here. This depicts the McLean House, the parlor where Grant and Lee meet so that Lee can surrender the Army of Northern Virginia. Couldn't tell you if he's in there. I've looked them over. I don't know. But I think a lot of these are just generalized people, figures of officers that were there. Sharpe does describe what was going on, the conversations. After the surrender details are set, Grant, in a step of fraternity, says to Lee, again, soldiers are always hungry, have your men eaten? Do you need any rations? How many would you need? General Grant, I'm really not sure. Lee's army has been chopped to pieces as it's going towards Appomattox. Grant says, well, do you think about 25,000 rations would be good? Yes, I think that'll be about right. Well, there's actually 28,000. How did Grant know more about Lee's army than Lee did himself? The work of the BMI. Sharpe is put into command of issuing the paroles for the Confederate Army as he's meeting with these officers. And there's some 28, well, men in the ranks and officers, some 28,000 meets with the officers. Many of them are surprised that he knows more about what unit their regiment was with than these officers did themselves. There had been so much reorganization on that road towards Appomattox. Starting to get the hang of this, folks. Okay, here we go. This is a picture of the parole. Now, as I said, Sharpe has to parole the whole Confederate Army. He gets a message from an aide of Robert E. Lee. Lee says, I want to be issued a parole as well. Parole was basically a document that said, I swear that I will not take up arms against the United States until duly exchanged. So it's not like our parole, but pro forma thing at the time. Well, Sharpe has some hesitations about issuing a parole to a man like Robert E. Lee. He thinks it's presumptuous and disrespectful. Lee, however, and he sends that message back. Lee says, no, wait a minute, I'm a soldier, I'm a member of the Army of Northern Virginia. I need to be paroled. Now, whether Lee sort of could see the future a little bit, or what the radical Republicans might do as far as taking vengeance on the South, who knows? Sharpe consults with Grant, and yes, it's decided that a parole will be issued to Lee. But Sharpe decides to add this annotation that you may or may not be able to see well, but it says, the within named officers will not be disturbed by the United States authorities as long as they observe their parole and the laws in force where they reside. On the advice of the other Union officers that are in the Surrender Commission, it's decided that Sharpe himself, he's now an assistant provost marshal general, he'll sign the paroles for these men. Sure enough, radical Republicans take steps to charge Robert E. Lee with treason. He produces this document. He's observed the terms of his parole. He hasn't broken any laws. He shouldn't be harassed by the authorities of the United States. General Grant hears about this, hears about the parole being presented. He testifies in front of these radical Republicans. He states that he, Grant, will resign as Lieutenant General in charge of all the Union armies unless this matter is dropped. Well, Grant's so popular in the country, the matter's dropped. Robert E. Lee potentially is saved from the gallows by the actions of our buried treasure here in Kingston. I've always found this just so fascinating and so, well, heartwarming. Okay. so often happened in this time, mementos were taken, something to remember, a historical event. Sharpe pays Mr. McLean, the owner of the building where the surrender took place, $10 for these candlestick holders. They used to be on display here in the Senate House Museum. Now, my love of Civil War history began when I was 11. On the other side of this building, down in the cellar, there was a room that was just filled. Ed, you probably remember, full of memorabilia. Seward, I know you do because you had to pack it all up. What a shame. Anyway, I'm 11 years old. This is a centennial of the Civil War. I was in that room hour and a half, 2 hours. I walked home down Fair Street. I don't remember my feet touching the ground, honest to God. I really don't. And I think that's where my love of Civil War history came from. I can't swear to it, but I bet these candlestick holders were there. Sharpe returns to Washington, D.C. with these lists of paroles, and he's in Washington for the funeral of President Lincoln, who's now been assassinated. Sharpe is representing the state of Georgia. Georgia, you say? Well, why not? They never left the Union as far as Lincoln was concerned, so they should be represented at his funeral. He wears this sword. Notice the black crape on it. Sign of mourning. It may be that this crape, again, people took mementos back then, it may be that this crape was taken from the bier where Lincoln's casket lay and tied on at a later date. Here we have, now I assume this was engraved after the fact because it shows Brevet Major General George Sharpe, also shows his other rank when he never gave up as Colonel, 120th New York. And here we have another shot of the sword with the crape. This sword also used to be part of the Senate House collection. They're not here anymore. Well, we have to conserve them. They're in boxes in a place called Peebles Island. I don't see how 11-year-old boys can walk home down Fair Street with their feet not touching the ground when some of our historical treasures aren't being used to inspire and educate them, but they're in boxes. Okay, enough politics. Okay. May 1865, Sharpe is in Richmond. He's involved in establishing a parole for John S. Mosby, the partisan raider. After that duty's done, Sharpe, at his own request, leaves command of the BMI. He returns to his colonelcy and leads the 120th New York in the Grand Review Parade on May 23rd down the streets of Washington, D.C. He rode Babe, that was his war horse, through most of the war. Now here we got a picture of Babe. Babe's, I think, on the right. Another one of his horses is Captain on the left. And the story goes that after Babe, at least, passed away, many years later, about 30 years later, I think, he was buried behind Sharpe's mansion, which was on Albany Avenue. We'll look at that at the very end of this. And his bones may still be there. Okay, Sharpe then travels back to Kingston with the 120th. He uses his influence to unravel one more snafu that delayed the official mustering out of the 120th by a day or two. Anyway, he then has ended his official active military life. Keep in mind, this man's been instrumental in the Chancellorsville campaign, the Gettysburg campaign, at Appomattox, and also, I firmly believe, keeping Robert E. Lee off the gallows. Okay. Post-military. He returns back to his law practice, and he grows that, but The country isn't done with them yet. This picture of John Surratt, one of the conspirators in Lincoln's assassination. January 1867, the State Department taps Sharpe to go to Europe to find out if there's any citizens there that may have been involved in the conspiracy. I don't know how much more time we got, so I'm moving this ahead a wee bit. Long story short, he doesn't find any evidence, but I want to give you, he travels to London, then to Rome, back to Paris, Brussels, does a great job as far as he's concerned, and me too from what I've read and seen about it. He reports to Secretary Seward, who presents the report to Andrew Johnson, who forwards it to the House Judiciary Committee. Sharpe concludes, conscious that earnestness was brought to the attempt at identifying the loathsome instigators of the great crime, capital letters, and that every possible assistance was received, I have to report that in my opinion no such legal or reasonable proof exists in Europe of the participation of any persons there, formerly citizens of the United States, as to call for action of the government. Okay. 1868, Sharpe is a delegate to the Republican National Convention. He supports Grant. Grant's elected. 1870, Grant appoints Sharpe as the U.S. Marshal for the Southern District of New York. Great word. He has shrievalty duties down there. Not duties of a sheriff, but great word, shrievalty. He also is responsible, or given the assignment of taking the 9th census, the 1870 census. Sharpe takes on the Boss Tweed political ring down there. Corrupt a bunch of folks. Almost said a different word. There's fraud, there's corruption, there's big money involved. This is serious business down there. Sharpe's life is threatened a number of times. He perseveres. He prosecutes a number of people. And he ends up convicting 2, quote, major perpetrators, including one who is a member of the General Democratic Committee. Not really sure what that means. That could be the equivalent of our National Democratic Committee now. He also oversees the overtaking of, quote, a thorough and accurate census, unquote, which purges the voter rolls of fraud, leads to honest elections, and the breaking of the Tweed ring in New York City. Our buried treasure here. Not missed a slide. I just could have put some other ones in here, I guess. You figure this out as you run these things. 1873, Sharpe's appointed by Grant to be the surveyor of the Port of New York. His job there is to review appraisals done in the office of the port's customs collector. The customs collector, by the way, is Chester A. Arthur. Sharpe holds this post till 1878. The fall of 78, Sharpe's elected to the New York State Assembly. Floor chart of the Assembly at the time. 1880, January, and again in January 1881, Sharpe's selected to be the Speaker of the Assembly. Now, the fall of 1881, the Democrats take the Assembly over. Sharpe loses his Speaker position, but he's still with the Assembly till 1883. 1880, he again is selected to be a delegate at the Republican National Convention. He supports Grant for a 3rd term. Grant's, his administration's been rife with corruption, etc. He doesn't get the nod. 36 ballots later, James Garfield selected to be the presidential candidate. Nothing like the watered down, conventions we see now. Lots of smoke in those back rooms, Anyway, now for the vice presidential candidate. Sharpe champions Chester A. Arthur, customs collector, Port of New York he's worked with. He works for Arthur on the floor, in committee. He's a mover and a shaker in Chester A. Arthur being named vice president. When Garfield is assassinated, Chester A. Arthur becomes president. How much Does our hidden treasure? How much of a kingmaker was he? I don't know. Good field of study. But I think there's something to be found there. It is known he's an advisor and counselor for Chester Arthur through his administration. Arthur visits him here in Kingston. President Arthur, in his turn, appoints Sharpe to be commissioner on a commission that promotes trade with Central and South America. Sharpe has the titles of Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary. Gives him the powers of an ambassador, a little bit above the ambassador. Has to work with him, of course, but he has some pretty significant powers. He holds that office until 1885 when Grover Cleveland becomes president and Sharpe resigns. 1890, Sharpe's appointed member of the U.S. General Appraisers of New York City by Benjamin Harrison. He's part of a three-person panel with judicial and administrative powers in appeals cases in customs cases. The one example I read was ladies' hats had boa feathers. Were they being charged too much in the customs? This could be something that would be adjudicated by Sharpe. His legal skills, his diplomatic skills come into play here. This is a permanent position with a salary greater than any federally appointed judgeship except the U.S. Supreme Court judge. Sharpe now, he's getting on in age. He's considering his retirement. He has said that when he reaches age 70, he wants to retire. 1898, he submits his resignation. It's not accepted. He resubmits in February 1899. President McKinley accepts, saying that he regrets, quote, that you find your advanced years inconsistent with a continuation in the public service with best wishes for your health and prosperity, President McKinley. We're almost done here, folks. Sharpe's military experiences forever frames him. He's known for the rest of his life as General Sharpe, not Mr., not Marshal, not Assemblyman, but General Sharpe. He's active in Northern Veterans Affairs for decades after the war. In 1870, he's the Secretary of the Society of the Army of the Potomac. He's president of the Third Corps Association. He shares podiums with Grant, Hooker, Sickles, Sherman, Hancock, and many others. 1877, he's made commander of the New York Commandery of the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, or MOLUS. Any of you folks know that this is a very prestigious organization that still exists today. We have at least one member here with us. 1888, he's instrumental in convincing Confederate veterans to attend the 25th reunion of the Battle of Gettysburg. And this is a time of rapprochement in the country. I just think this is great. Get these two sides together. He uses his skills. He's instrumental in this. He stays an integral part of the 120th, the veterans that are around here. When a regimental union is formed in 1868, Sharpe, of course, is named its president. He's instrumental in the design and installation of the 120th monument at Gettysburg Battlefield, which we see here. Anybody been down and seen it? Yeah, quite a magnificent monument. You see the ground that the men fought on? Place to hide? No place. Stand up, fight. It's amazing. And they did it. They did it. This isn't just something in a history book. They did it. Okay. Sharpe's there at the dedication of the monument, July 25th, 1889. He talks about the 120th valor, recounts their losses on the field. He ends by saying, "How rich are the treasures of the 120th in this clear upper sky. Oh, brothers, whose valor is the occasion of this solemnity, bend an ear to the peaceful fields, which are now your home, and pardon the last efforts of a voice which is not unknown to you." there's one last act that Sharpe does for his comrades in the 120th. Sharpe funds and saw erected the monument, which is down in the old Dutch church, kirkyard. It's called the Daughter of the Regiment. The pedestal is of the red granite that was used for the base of the Statue of Liberty. It's the only known monument erected by a Civil War commander at his own expense to honor the men in the regiment, not the colonel, the men. Sharpe, of course, spoke on October 17th, 1896. This is a couple paragraphs, but I just love this old language. He closes his remarks. In the order of nature, when in the order of nature you and I shall have crossed the river and rest under the shade of the trees with the superb Hancock and his great rival Stonewall Jackson, we may mount to the heights of the Delectable Mountains. From it the eternal towers will be open to our view, and as we repose reclining, we may descry the throngs of the great and good of all ages who wend their way to the immortal mansions. We shall from time to time be attracted by greater bodies, which in the world below may have fought for great ideas. A far larger concourse than usual will receive salutations that will be echoed back to the rainbow rafters. 1 hour. Rainbow rafters and the heaven-built walls, as will glad acclaim, the shout will go up. All hail to the banners of the Army of the Potomac, the Army of Liberty forevermore. We salute the colors of the 120th New York. I'm really sorry that had to happen in the middle of this. Okay. Sharpe dies January 13th, 1900. He's in New York City, visiting his daughter and her family. An illness occurs. He has an operation from which he does not rally. The New York Assembly, on news of his death, offers obsequies to his memory, then immediately adjourns in his honor. He's buried in Wiltwyck Cemetery. Notice just the other day, almost directly across from him, is John Rudolph Tappan, his comrade. Sharpe, therefore, was not at the 50th anniversary reunion of the day the 120th left for the war front, that being August 22nd. So August 22nd, 1912, the survivors of the 120th have this reunion. Here we see the picture of him around the Daughter of the Regiment. Sharpe's duly remembered, and a memorial medal is presented in his honor to each of the 80 or so survivors, the surviving members of the regiment. The cost of the medallion is paid for by Sharpe's children. Picture of the memorial book and the medallion. By the way, if you want to look at it a little closer, ta-da, here it is. The medallion is presented to the veterans by Sharpe's granddaughter, Catherine. Now, we got a couple more of these slides. I still call them slides to wind up, but I want to finish my semi-prepared remarks with something that was done in 1937 at the Ulster County Historical Society by its president, G.D.B. Hasbrook. Now, he closes his remarks this way. General Sharpe's important service and high rank in the Civil War made him the representative soldier of Ulster County. His high character and honorable life bespoke him an exemplary citizen. His kneeling at the altar where his forebears worshipped exhibits his religious hope. General Sharpe was a good and great man. This study, Hasbrook's study, has brought me to the realization that when he died, there passed a glory from the earth. Well, we had a buried treasure pass from the earth. So I thank you for your attention. But let me show you a couple more things. This is something that was brought to my attention by Seward Osborne. By the way, a lot of these pictures are from Seward's collection. This was Sharpe's walking cane. This was sold on eBay, I assume it got sold, February of 2000. Now there was a reserve price on it, $950. It was met. Don't know how much it went for, I'm too rich for my money. Okay, you'll see here, being the old teacher, by the way, substitute teacher. Sorry you're losing the mic, but I learned as a substitute teacher, you got to keep moving. Remember what you did to substitute teachers? Got to keep moving, harder to hit a moving target. Okay. Well, we have close-ups, but you'll see the 120th. You see bits of ivory on the handle of the cane. You see names. Well, I jumped ahead. Those names are the officers of the 120th who died in service in the Civil War by wounds, illness, etc. He never wanted to let go of these men, so he had them as part of his cane. There was a sign back there, a little emblem that said "Brave Men All." And you could see carved in there a G and an H and a big S for Sharpe. Okay. We got that. I'm going to be asking for help in a minute here. Maybe, Ed, you're going to be able to help me. This is George Sharpe's mansion, the orchard, of course, all the trees that were around it. I was looking at this when I was coming on up here today. This is where the Governor Clinton Hotel is now. Now, it does say, if you can read the postcard, it says Judge Sharpe. Now, whether his son lived in that building afterwards, okay, this must have been a later postcard shot. 1924, the building has to be moved to make way for the Governor Clinton Hotel. Well, jacks were brought out. The building was raised. Huge timbers were put underneath it. It was moved backwards 200 feet. And it's said that not a brick was lost, not a window was broken. That's an amazing feat of engineering. This is a huge building. It was used as an annex for the Governor Clinton Hotel for years till it was knocked down in the mid-1960s. Now, my father worked there as a cook. That's where he met my mother, who was working in the kitchens there too. Now, he was already out of there by the mid-1960s. Too bad, though, I didn't know this was up there, because I would have loved to have been in this building. Anyway, it's knocked down, it's gone. We have here something that some folks have been probably waiting impatiently. He said, "Shut up, Walt, I want to see the picture." Anyway, here we are. These are pictures of the interior of the building. Now, I hadn't seen these before myself. But these come from the Friends of Historic Kingston? Yes. Okay. So this is another postcard shot, or another shot. It actually was from an atlas, an engraving of the building. This, I believe, is his parlor, and then a detail of the outside of the building. Nice portrait of George there. No, we have a guest room. I guess I should probably, well, I can leave some of them up anyway, the last one, I suppose. This is a guest room which was occupied by General Grant, the Presidents Grant and Arthur, as well as William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman spoke in the Armory on Broadway to raise funds for the Civil War monument that's in front of City Hall. The drawing room of the mansion, there on the right. Magnificent looking building. Sure glad we have more parking space behind it. No, now. Yeah. Yeah, I remember that one too. Here we have a picture. There's those candlestick holders. Oops. Now this you can't see, but I was looking at this closer. This is a handwritten order from Robert E. Lee to Sharpe, allowing him to go through the Confederate, back and forth between the Confederate lines to effect the paroles in the surrender proceedings. So he kept that the rest of his life. A little placard up there that says, Secretary Arthur slept here. Another one, Ulysses S. Grant slept here. The other, I guess, is a foyer entrance to the building there, Ed? So, just magnificent. And I think that ends it for us here, folks. Okay, thank you very much. Any questions?
I learned this weekend from Patrick Schroeder, who is the Park Service Director at Appomattox, also the chief historian there, that the candlesticks are on permanent loan to the Smithsonian.
Ah, very good. Thank you very much for that. Glad to hear that one made it out of the box. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
How did they name the Sharpe cemetery?
Gee, I,
Different family?
Yes, this Sharpe, General Sharpe, was a key on
yeah,
under his name. The other one was not.
yeah, man, that was,
Sent me back.
That was I think that was named after Peter Sharpe, and I believe he lived in Albany.
yep. So, yes.
Did Meade confer with Sharpe after the third day of Gettysburg about whether to stay or go after him?
Couldn't say for sure. I wouldn't doubt it. Reports, Sharpe's name is just peppered through the official records of the Civil War. I would say that he did. Of course, we know Meade, it was said, didn't really pursue Lee as energetically as he could. I really, you know, these men are tired. These men are worn out. There was some discussion that perhaps there was a falling out between Meade and Sharpe a little further on in the war. That may have been partly due to the jealousy between Meade and Grant when Grant came from the West. Grant took Sharpe's side. Sharpe stayed in his position. Yes, sir.
Has there been any books written about General Sharpe and the BMI?
Not that I'm aware of, but I think there's somebody working on one. Isn't that right, Seward? Yeah. There's a great field of study. There's a lot of information there. I mean, I was going like crazy to try to get this done in an hour here. There's a lot of info there.
Is there any other questions?
Anything else?
We've been waiting for this for a long time. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Wonderful job.
Oh, thanks. So if you guys, thanks again.
Walt, before everybody leaves, again, we really want to thank Walt. Those of you who were here last week, too, with Ted Dietz, these people are here donating their time. It's a lot of effort to put this together for all of us, and everybody's doing this free. So we really appreciate, Walt, what you're doing. Stuart Osborne, thank you for donating the pictures. Dr. Peter Roberts had donated the pictures of the home, and I invite you to come on up. I know it's hard to see in the back, the pictures, but come on up. They're spectacular. Joe Tantillo had put together the flyers you may have seen and put together the PowerPoint presentation. So we want to thank all of you. Bob Rizzo for taping this for us, and if anybody wants to obtain a copy of the video, they can see Bob or Ann Gordon or myself. We're trying to keep a library of this, and as you can see, Kingston has had many individuals that were not only incredibly important in our community and in our state, but nationally. There is a host of people, and that's what this lecture series is intended to do. So every month, we're going to be choosing another person, and we have some coming up. We have on October 19th, right in time for the upcoming election, there will be a presentation on Alton Parker, Ulster County resident. He lived actually first on Pearl Street and then out in Esopus at Rosemont. He was a local attorney. He was a Ulster County Surrogates Court judge, then an Ulster County Supreme Court judge here for many years. He became chief judge of the New York State Court of Appeals, the highest court in New York, and in 1904 he became the Democratic Party's candidate for President of the United States. So John Wadlin, who's a local attorney here, will be doing a presentation on that. That will be October 19th, 5:30 right here at the Senate House. And November 16th, ordinarily we're going to be doing this the third Friday of every month. Due to the holiday season, that may change. So in November, it's going to be the second Friday, and that is going to be a presentation by Ann Gordon, our county historian, on Sojourner Truth, another international figure in the fight against slavery and the fight for equality. So these are all people who are part of our community. And it's important that we remember them, that we learn about them, and we pass this on. We really take for granted what we have here. So we hope that you'll continue to come. If anybody, if I stay at your house anytime and you want to put a plaque that I was there, feel free. My name is Paul O'Neill. I will, in fact, let me know. I'll bring the plaque with me. One more interesting tidbit with regard to George Sharpe and the breakup of Boss Tweed's ring. Boss Tweed was actually tried and sentenced by another Kingston individual. The Judge Theodoric Westbrook was the one who actually sentenced Boss Tweed. So we have the Boss Tweed ring was broken up by a Kingston resident, and it was finally terminated by a Kingston resident.
Theodore Westbrook was the brother of the 3rd Lieutenant Colonel of the 120th, who was wounded previously twice at Gettysburg.
It's amazing, and thank you for that. And we have many people like that. And one thing to remember is that if this was back, if George Sharpe was alive, he would be here tonight. During his lifetime, particularly after the Civil War, if you were to look back at Kingston history, any major event, historical event that came about, you would always find General George Sharpe as the presenter. So he would appreciate what we're doing. We appreciate you, everyone, being here. And I see there's a question.
Mr. O'Neill, are you going to post these on the community bulletin board?
We do.
On Channel 23?
Oh, yes. In fact, Bob is going to be putting that on. Those of you who were here last time, I actually was trying to tape it on top of this case with my ancient camera. That one I don't think is going to get on, but Bob will do a much better job.
One of the things, Hasbro family, of course, was huge, basically, from the beginning of Ulster County. But I can't sit here tonight and not recognize that my wife, Jean, is a relative of George Sharpe's wife, Karen.
Well, if we can have a hand for, and we actually have a Brune here. Mike Brune is sitting back there. Now, whether he's related to that family, if he is, he's a...
We have here a biography prepared by Seward Osborne, the eminent Civil War historian in Ulster County, my mentor. So I'm going to leave these up. I have some copies. I'll leave them up here at the front table. And that 50th anniversary of the 120th leaving, festivities took place right out here in this yard. So when you're leaving, this is close.
So Walt, again, thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. I think we all learned a lot. Thank you, everybody. Hopefully we'll see you next month. And again, feel free to come on up. I know it's difficult to see the pictures, but they are
How you doing?
spectacular.
How's things going there? Yeah, this is the book.